This is The Meaningful Way. I'm your host, Luke Iorio. So today, we get the pleasure to talk about how do we strip away things to get to the heart of what matters. Today, we're going to consider how we want to be alive in this life and reflect on how we matter to and impact our world. I am joined by writer, coach, consultant, dharma teacher, and social change activist, Colin Beavan. He is the author, most recently, of How to Be Alive, a guide to the kind of happiness that helps the world. He first attracted international attention for his year-long lifestyle redesign project and the wildly popular book, No Impact Man, which ultimately inspired a Sundance-selected documentary film. He's appeared on Nightline, Good Morning America, The Report, the Montell Show, and NPR to share his story. He's even been featured in news outlets from Time Magazine to the New York Times. He's now a sought-after speaker by wide-ranging audiences. He also consults with individuals and organizations on living and operating in ways that marry prosperity with the promotion of peace, happiness, justice, right action, and goodwill. He's also the author of several other books, including the Operation Jedburgh, D-Day in America's First Shadow War, as well as Fingerprints, The Origins of Crime Detection, and The Murder Case. He is well-read, well-respected, and well-versed, and I cannot wait to get into this conversation. Colin, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I guess maybe the place to start that I was curious about was before the year-long journey that was the No Impact and your own personal No Impact project. I'm just kind of curious, what was going on for you that really prompted the desire to jump in full force to such a dramatic shift and live No Impact?
So No Impact Man was a project that I did in the year 2007, and it was a year in which I lived as environmentally as possible with my family in New York City, and I wrote a book about it, and we made a film about it. And right before that, I had written a book called Operation Jedburgh, which is a book about a secret operation in World War II. And I had interviewed about 70 veterans from this operation during World War II. And it was a top secret operation, so it had just been declassified. And so these veterans were telling me their war stories for the first time. And they weren't happy stories. They were stories of being in war. And in some way, I think, people talk about the post-traumatic distress, post-traumatic stress disorder from being in war. And then there's this secondary PTSD that social workers and therapists can get. And I feel like I had a little bit of that, actually, from hearing all these terrible stories. And then, so I was kind of broken open to the suffering of war. And then, of course, we were in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I was reading all the news of climate change. And just between all of that, I thought, I just can't go on writing, storybooks. I have to find a way to use my talent as a writer, to help people get on board in assisting in finding the solutions to our global crises. So I was kind of in this spot, like, how do I use my writing talent to draw attention to the problems? And I thought about just writing this book about climate change, and everybody said, yeah, but that's a downer. Who wants to buy a book like that? And then one day I came into my house. It was a hot summer day, really hot. And I came into my apartment, and I opened the door to my apartment, and frigid air came pouring out over me. And it was because I had left both air conditioners on in the apartment all day long, just because I didn't like to have to wait 20 minutes for the apartment to cool down. And I realized at that moment, I said, well, geez, we're in wars for energy, basically wars about energy. And people are dying. And I thought, if people are dying for energy and I am wasting energy by leaving my air conditioners on all day long, what does that say about me? And so that kind of led to this idea, well, instead of writing about how all you people should change, all you people out there, what about if I created a story about how me and my little family, as it was then comprised, what about if I write a story about how we changed? And so we came up with this idea. It was called No Impact Man. and we lived environmentally as possible over the course of a year in New York City.
So, a ton of questions there. I guess the first thing that I just wanted to acknowledge, because we don't get into it as much on this show as maybe we call out some other things. I love the perspective that you bring in where you're essentially connecting the dots, the systemic effect of who we are and how that then begins to show up in the world. And so when you started, to look at what became your impact, but started out with wars, how do the wars connect to energy? How does an energy connect to what our personal habits and our personal way of being and living happen to be? Because I think that's one of the things that at times we're challenged by, is that we don't necessarily think about the full ripple effect of who we are and how we operate and who we work for and those type of effects. So I really appreciate you bringing that out. I guess let me start here. How do you plan for something like that? I mean, when you take on something like a no impact project, and to be the no impact, you're going to do this for 12 months. What goes into kicking that off?
Yeah, it's a really interesting dilemma, and one that I just want to. I'm going to answer that question. I want to address something you just said before I move on. You talked about this idea of how our lives actually are connected to big global political situations, and that suggests that since the way that we live our lives are actually connected to wars or to climate change or to other problems, that we need to think ethically, but about how we live our lives because we impact the world. Well, one of my big learnings over the last 10 years is that the way that we might adapt our lives to be more ethical in terms of having less negative and more positive impacts on our local and world communities, not only is it more ethical, but it turns out to be generally, oftentimes, it's a generalization. It's not always true, but it's largely true. It turns also out to be a way of life that is also happier and healthier for us too. And we'll probably talk more about that. But I just wanted to say that it's not about kind of putting on the horsehair shirt and paying penance for our sins as Westerners, but actually looking at a path that's both better for us and better for the world. I just wanted to say that.
Absolutely. I'm glad you did, because we are going to come to that. I absolutely do want to dive further into that. Good.
So in terms of planning for the year, when I did No Impact, I wasn't an environmentalist who was seeking to demonstrate my environmental knowledge by living environmentally inside a bubble. But I like to say, just your average schlub who ventured forth. So part of the story that's told in the book and the film is about how do you actually figure all that out? Yeah. And so what I actually did was I said, okay, I'm going to give myself a break. And I'm going to out certain actions that make sense, and I'm going to do those actions for a month, and then I'm going to move on to the next action, and I'm going to include the previous action until I feel as though I'm 100% no impact. So I didn't do that because I read that's how to do it. Right. I just thought this is how I'm going to do it, and if it doesn't work, then that will be part of the story. So for the first month, for me in the No Impact year was just learning how not to buy anything new. So except socks and underwear and toothbrushes were accepted. But besides for that, any clothes, any electronics, we bought secondhand. And which is interesting because it turns out that buying secondhand is also cheaper, and secondhand things that are in good condition actually tend to work and last longer than brand new things because things tend to fail when they're brand new. Anyway, that's all
interesting.
Things. Yeah. So that goes to what I was saying about better for the world and better for us, right? So, and then we moved on to not making trash, which is much harder than you think, because everything, food items come in packaging, etc. Sure. And then to no fossil fuel using transportation and on it. So through each of the stages until finally what I called the give back stage, which was where we not just worked on reducing our negative impact, but volunteered and did work to help the environment. So it was a positive. So basically the idea was that we would be no impact by, on the one hand, reducing our negative impact,
right,
and then increasing our positive impact, so that reduced negative impact plus increased positive impact would be no impact, right?
Right.
Which technically, if you ask an environmental scientist, doesn't actually work out.
Mm-hmm.
But it did beg this kind of fundamental philosophical question, which is it possible to live doing more good than harm?
Yeah. Well, so a handful of things that are brought up in there. One is the domino effect of what you were seeking, I think is a really important thing for people to recognize, because too often we get this vision, this goal of an ideal that we want to be able to achieve, such as no impact. And then we give ourselves precisely, 72 hours to go out and accomplish it, as opposed to looking at what is the domino effect, what is the momentum that can be built to ultimately achieve it. And I think the other important point that you just brought up is around this idea of it's striving for. It is something that was held out there, and the striving for it and what you achieve by striving for it was more important than does it, absolutely equal what a sustainability expert would say is exactly no impact or not. It was more what gets created through the process of, and how close you can ultimately come to that. And it's the same type of thing. I think that's the worthy ideals that we shoot for. How is it that we change in that process? And so I guess maybe before we shift to some of the newer stuff that you're doing and really what this led to, I guess maybe that's one other thing that I would love to hear about just from the no impact side of this. What do you feel changed the most for you personally and even for your family over the course of that year?
Right. So I also want to just add something to the comment that you made before I answer that question, which is that the other thing was what you were saying about striving for the goals and perfectionism around goals and the journey, not the end, and all of that kind of stuff. One of the other things that I learned was, one of the things, I had a blog going at that stage and it blew up and I would get hundreds of comments. But one of the things that people would say, sometimes critics would say, is, well, if you believe in being no impact, why don't you just commit suicide? Then you'll have no impact, right?
Right.
which is, but it does beg that does beg a question. Wait, is that our job on the planet, just to not have no impact? Right. Is that is that our direction? And what it made me realize is that it's not just about reducing our resource use. It's about making sure, yes, it is about reducing resource use and not wasting and preserving the habitat that we depend upon for our health and our happiness and our security. But it's also about making sure that those resources that we do use are used for good. Yeah. Right. So that goes everything from, there's a difference between having a can of fizzy sugar water and the resources that can uses, and a can of orange juice, which actually has nutritional, right? So in one case, we shouldn't use the resources. In the other case, we should. That's on the small scale. Sure. On the bigger scale, when they say, if you want to be no impact, why don't you just kill yourself? What you say as a human being is, I use resources on this planet, and my life itself is a resource. Yes. For what should that resource be used, right? What is my life actually for? That's interesting, because there's the side of this, which is, again, for everybody to make sure that they're taking away, is that to gain the greatest impact and to make the difference in the way that you want to make the difference, you're talking about that maximization of what has the positive impact that you want to have, and the minimization of things that take away from that or deplete or drain in any regard as well, so that you're working on both parameters at any given time, which is what's going to create the most leveraged effect that you can possibly create. And I think the viewing of ourselves as part of that resource is a really interesting way to think about, why is it that we connect to certain things? And we're off script now officially, which usually is about the right mark of this interview process, right? is because this gets into the other stuff that you get into with your new book and your new work, where the more that we really truly discover the way we want to use our life as a resource, meaning what is it that matters most to us and the way that we want to connect to it. You describe, and I've heard it in some of your book and in some of your videos, of how you begin to uncover your true self, and how the connect to that true self is actually something that directly benefits the world when you lean into it. And I was hoping you could speak more then to that idea of how is it that finding your true self actually is a mechanism to change the world. Right. So I mean, this impinges on the question which you previously asked, which was kind of like, what was the big learning of no impact? Right. And so, first of all, when we lived no impact, for example, we got rid of our television, and that meant And well, basically, we got rid of our television, and we weren't eating takeout and restaurant food like people in New York typically do. So we had no television, but we did always have a pot of freshly made, homemade, local food soup in the fridge. And the result of those two things is that because we were bored with no TV, we were always inviting friends over, and they wanted to come so what happened was that getting rid of the TV, this is just one example, caused us to spend more time with each other and with our friends. Yeah. It caused me to spend more time. People always worry about how much TV a kid watches, but I always think about how much TV a parent watches. So it caused me to spend more time with my kid. So it's just an example of what one of the big things that I learned is that actually a happy, meaningful life doesn't come from the use of a lot of resources. It doesn't come from buying and using and having a lot of stuff. It comes from our relationship to the world. Right. And it also comes from this is to your question about how becoming ourselves helps the world. I take a lot of what I learned through the No Impact Man experience and through the really hundreds and thousands of people that I've talked to who are what I call them in How to Be a Life questers. Life quester is somebody who is questing after a way of life that's both good for them and good for their local and larger community. And in some ways that way of life is not laid down yet, because we used to think, we would be told, go to college, get a job, do your job, pay your taxes, buy things. That will keep the government going. That will keep the factories going, keep other people. And that's how you do good in the world, just by fitting yourself into the slot. But so many of us are finding now, first of all, it's hard to get a job for some people, and it's hard to get benefits if you find a job. And second of all, those of us who are getting success at that system, a lot of us have this kind of dis-ease where we're feeling like we're kind of getting ahead at the expense of everybody else. So it doesn't feel like we're doing good by the world by doing it by ourselves. So a life quester is somebody who's looking for the new path to doing good by themselves, good by the world. So to your question about how finding your true self automatically comes out in terms of helping the world. There's a branch of this, the science of psychology called self-determination theory. And basically what this Professor Ed Detchi and his partner up at the University of Rochester and many other scientists since have tried to do is to prove the tenets of humanistic psychology. And humanistic psychology basically says that we have like a psyche or an organism, and that the purpose of that psyche or organism is to expand and grow and to become, to actually grow into itself and to more or less be authentic, right? To actually be who we really are. In this science of self-determination theory, what they discovered is we have three basic psychological needs, assuming that our needs for security are met, our biological needs are met. The next needs that we have are the need for autonomy, which means the feeling that we're acting of our own volition, that we're acting according to our own ideas and inspirations, so our passions, you could say. The need for effectiveness, that is the feeling, the ability to feel that what we do actually matters in our own lives and in the lives of others. And the need for relatedness, which is to say that we're connected to other people and that we are actually having a positive effect on other people's lives. Those are inbred psychological needs. That will generally always manifest unless some trauma has come up and caused, perverted our psyches, right? So basically, if you take those together, what we're saying is that it's a psychological need to become our true selves in a way that helps our community. That it's hardwired in us, and that when we let go of the shoulds and the obligations of that aren't working anymore, and actually return to our inner valuing process, we will, because we're hardwired this way, automatically want to help our fellow human beings, because it's a need. The data shows it's a hardwired need. So to truly, just to be clear now, becoming in our society, sometimes becoming yourself is thought of as a narcissistic thing, right? And misinterpreted, becoming yourself is a narcissistic thing. If you think, well, I want a Maserati, I want a Lamborghini, and I want a big house, and I want, the best looking romantic partner, and you say, that's the true me, and I'm going to follow the true me. I would argue that's not the deepest part of ourselves. Right. That in fact, if we want the real reason why we want a fancy car is to be valued by the people around us, right? And so actually working towards being valued by the people around us directly, instead of having to earn $100,000 for a car first, is more likely to make us happy. So when I say becoming your true self, it means actually moving past the surface level materialistic desires to the deeper needs that you might be hoping will be met by fulfilling those materialistic desires.
And I'm glad you went to that part as well, because I think that's one of the things that when we're so caught up by what's in the media, what's on TV, the latest email that's come in, the latest post on social media, the last request from our boss, the climbing the corporate ladder, whatever all these things are, a lot of it are the things that we pursue or the things we distract ourselves with are just strategies to meet some type of an underlying need that we actually have. And we don't necessarily spend enough time to really understand, what do we really value? What is that real need that's there? Like you said, if it is to feel like you're acknowledged and recognized by other people and seen as valuable, well, one way to do that might be you get their attention through flashy stuff or whatever. Another may be through these other types of projects which lean into your talents and abilities, but in ways that give back in some capacity, just by the nature of what it is that you do. And I was hoping you could share, because I know there were a few examples that you had in How to Be Alive of just some just wonderful stories of people who were doing this. And I was hoping you could share one or two of these so people can get a sense of what this can look like.
Sure. So let's see. Oftentimes I share about my friend Kate Seidar, and so Kate was a person who started, she went to college. She was good at science. She's just naturally scientifically inclined. She's to my friend to this day, and she's just a brilliant creative person, one of my heroes, and was working in environmentalism when I started No Impact Man. So she was a person to whom I went for advice, and but anyway, she started out she went to college for biochemistry because she was good at it. And so that was the passion part, right? That was the kind of autonomy coming from your true self, right? And she went to college and she, got her degree, and then she went to work for a medical research laboratory. And she found herself working in this research laboratory here in New York City, and she was at the bottom of the scale. And her task literally each day was to take the brains out of dead mice, to liquefy them in a blender, and then to smear the liquefied brains on the slide, and then look at whatever she was looking at. Yeah, and it was totally morale crushing, but it was a good job, right? In the sense that the pay was good, and she got health insurance and a IRA and all of that, but she just couldn't do it, and so she quit without actually having another job. So she found herself involved in a community garden at a park here in Brooklyn, and one of the big problems with gardening in New York City is the soil quality. It has a lot of lead in it from the exhaust fumes and stuff. So she became interested in soil remediation because that's the biochemist in her, just scientist in her, just coming out. It just had to come out, right? And one of the ways to make soil good is through adding compost to it. And so she started composting, and the next thing you know, she got these big, gigantic barrels, and she put them in the corner of a park here in Brooklyn called McCarran Park, and she put cinder blocks at the bottom of them so that they would be really hard to move. She wrote a letter to the mayor saying, I'm going to set up this composting system for the community. Is that all right with you? And then she never got a reply from the mayor, but she would show this letter she wrote said, I have approval from the mayor. And then she put a sign up, and it said composting every Thursday afternoon from 1 to 3. And people came. And before you knew it, she had a community of over 100 families that were dropping off their compost in these barrels. And it was vermicomposting using worms. And then they were taking the compost and putting it back on the community garden. And then from there, and then what was really interesting is it turns out that there happened to be a lot of these composting geeks around New York City. And so there were composting piles all around New York City, people similar to Kate who had done this. You might think to yourself, well, she's starting that compost pile. What difference does one little compost pile make, right? But it turns out that there were people like her around the city also doing it. And because of the pressure of so many people actually taking their compost piles, these little compost piles, just a couple of years back, Mayor Bloomberg announced a pilot program where the Department of Sanitation was going to take up a citywide composting thing. So it was just like by this one little person following her passion. And then the next thing, of course, is that Kate ended up having a job in environmentalism and ended up being the executive director of a small environmental nonprofit. So the point was that she literally became herself. I mean, how more geeky can you get? Like composting, like to remediate soil. She literally became herself in a way that helps her community. And it did both of those things. It made her feel good about her life. It helped her community. And ultimately, it actually ended up landing her in a career that was really good for her, right? That it took her to the right place. Yeah, it created the alignment. Now, of course, it took a lot of faith for her to do that because you can imagine her friends and her family were all like, when are you going to get a job? And why are you screwing around with worms and compost? It actually led to the right place. And that's why I have this word that I mentioned before, life quester, because it's like the hero's journey, right? We're literally venturing into the unknown. We're just trusting ourselves. We're trusting what's coming up from deep inside ourselves and not following direction. And if you get this, I would argue actually that many of the problems we have in society at the moment are caused by too many of us following directions because so many of us don't believe in what's happening in the world. And if we were actually stopped following directions and started actually trusting our values on the inside, right? And living that out, and in our institutions, it might be a very healing thing.
Well, it's something that seems to be pretty magical because this is something that comes about, I've heard about, but in many, many different ways on this show, that when individuals get into alignment with themselves, when they find that congruence, it's amazing the life that begins to unfold in front of them. But of course, getting to that place of alignment, getting to that place of congruence, so you really truly know what do you value, how does that show up, how does it align to your values and your abilities and your personality and your passions and all these things, like you said, as a quest. And I really appreciate it from that perspective. And I guess before we kind of start to wind things down, I guess the one other big question here that I've got is, how do we begin to find our quest?
Right. So, I mean, this is this is the big challenging thing. To some extent, we have to be willing to be in darkness, so, or sometimes I think of it in the fog, like you have to, and when you're in fog, what you have to do is you slow down and you can't see 10 feet in front of you. You can only see 2 feet in front of you. So you take one step forward and then you can see 2 more feet in front of you. Or another way that I think about it is if you're on a street corner in New York City and you want to find the Empire State Building, but you can't ask anybody. Let's say you can't ask anybody, but you're standing on the street corner and you're like, which way do I go? You could just stay still, or you could walk in any direction. And it doesn't really matter what direction you walk in New York. Sooner or later, you'll come to a place where you can see the Empire State Building. And then you'll know. So in other words, you have to be willing to walk a little in the wrong direction. So first of all is to say that we have to just accept that our true selves do not work by just giving us always. Sometimes people have grand visions, but not always. Sometimes we just feel some discomfort and we just know we're not where we're supposed to be, right? And so we have to just trust that feeling and venture forward. But the next step, so if you see any hero story, I mean, we know about the hero's journey, right, that Joseph Campbell first articulated. But if you see any story, How to Tame a Dragon, which follows perfectly Joseph Campbell's kind of hero cycle, right? So the first thing is, so in How to Tame a Dragon, basically, I forgot the name of the main character. But basically, his dad is a big dragon killer, but this guy, he cannot bring himself to kill dragons, right? So he just trusts, I can't kill dragons. The next stage in the hero's journey is always that we find a guide, right? We find somebody who's just gone a little bit before us. So what I always suggest to people who are on the beginning of some sort of a quest to align their lives with who they really are, even when they might not know who they really are yet, right, is to find a community or a person who's a little bit ahead of them, who already is embodying, that maybe they're just attracted to them. So, for example, for Kate, it was finding community gardeners, people who, while her mom and her dad are saying, why aren't you going to medical school? These people were saying, why aren't you coming to dig in the garden with us, right? So you find a person or a group of people who are already beginning to embody the values that you'd like to embody. And I've heard this over and over again. And what's interesting, it doesn't mean that you have to divorce your old community. What I've heard from people is the fact that I found a community of people who shared my values meant that I didn't have to leave behind my old friends. Because the people who shared my values gave me the strength that I needed to be able to hold, I'm me and you're you, and it's okay that we're not exactly the same. Whereas if you don't have people that share values, it's too painful to live amongst people who don't share your values, if you see what I mean. So the first step is be with the discomfort, have some sense of where you're going, and I always say find a guide or a community that are ahead of you on the path.
I think that's all incredibly helpful, because it was funny, and I'm glad you went back to Kate for a moment, because even in the process that she used, a few of the things that, whether she knew she was using it or not, she started small, right? It was not, she wasn't going out to change composting in New York City. It was a couple of barrels to start composting right there in her neighborhood, something that she can control. It moves a little bit forward from that standpoint. And aside from what then unfolded from there, really, really important point that you just came out with that I don't lose is that sometimes change doesn't mean leaving people behind. Maybe it doesn't mean leaving your job right now. It doesn't mean those things yet. It just means let's expand a little bit. Let's go a little bit further in this direction. Let's look around. Let's see who else we've now found. And we can do this in a manner that is a little bit more momentum building. It's a little more confidence building. It's a little more clarity building. It doesn't need to necessarily be 2 feet and jump into the deep end of the pool overnight. We don't have to go about it that way, which takes some pressure off.
Right. And also, not only that, but it also allows us, what we said about it moving forward 2 feet in the fog, it also allows us to test.
Yes.
I think I'll be more, so I think I want to be a farmer. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, I think I want to be a farmer. Well, you don't have to quit your job and become a farmer right now. You can find a farm and you can go woofing, which is where people go and stay on just for a vacation for a week. You can just try it, right? And then you test and you go to the farm and say, I really did like the farming, but it turns out that it's not the farming per se. It's the sharing access to good food. So you kind of turn out, oh, really? I care about getting good food into my community, so you test your way forward. And the other thing, so first of all, it provides you with more information. And second of all, it means you don't have to burn your bridges. Yeah. Which we're always so scared about. Well,
and again, I love the perspective there of as you test out these different strategies, what you're continuing to do, pardon the pun, is unearth what is the real desire, what's the real value, and how that connects to your passion and to your abilities and your interests and things like that. And it's a peeling back type of an effect. And the deeper you go, the more you learn, the more that that true self begins to reveal itself, that is not caught up in what was the surface level strategies or ego or materialism or anything along those lines. Probably a good place for me to start to bring this around full circle. I guess two final questions for you that I enjoy asking. The first is, many, many, many years from now, how is it that you would like to be remembered, and by whom?
Oh gosh.
Big question.
Those questions have they have a hook for me in them, because then if I'm not careful, there's a reason why I'm a writer and a public speaker. I enjoy a certain amount of attention and accolades, right? So if I'm not careful, there's an ego hook in there,
sure.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. So the real question is what matters. I think first of all, I think absolutely the most important thing is that I wanted to be remembered as a loving, supportive, open parent to my daughter Isabella, and I want her to feel that as a parent, I continually opened her to herself and never closed her down, and supported her in her aspirations and supported her in making mistakes for herself. And I think that would be my first thing. I guess if I were to be really, my fondest choice, I think, would be to, as a writer, part of you wants to be like, I want to be remembered by hundreds of thousands of citizens. But one of the things that I've discovered is that I get many emails from readers who say that I've helped them, and that does give me a little boost. It gives me but I've discovered that some of the most satisfying work is around creating sustained, deep change in people and communities through my coaching work and my workshops. So I guess ultimately, I would like to feel as though I was a part of a community of, who knows, 10, 20, 100 people, and that I helped that community of people to open themselves to themselves and open themselves to the world, so that they found a way forward that was both felt meaningful and purposeful and safe, but also helped. Our world is suffering so much, so also helped to find a path forward in terms of putting a dent in that suffering.
Colin, you actually, in the way that you reframed that, you really answered my next question around what matters most to you at this point. I can hear a lot of that. So maybe if I change it a little bit, what really is the message that you would love for our listeners to walk away from this time together with you?
So first of all, one of the things that we haven't said that I really do want to say that's important to me, I like to have fun and joke around. To me, it's really important, just sometimes, because my work is very earnest and sincere, and sometimes people, when they hang out with me, get surprised because I have a very naughty sense of humor, but just sitting around and joking around, that's the best. So what I like to say is, I want to create a world where everybody can just sit around and joke around. Like that. That's what, to take away for the readers, and sorry, for our listeners, the takeaway that I would say is, we get stuck thinking we have to find the right job, the right relationship, or the right house and stuff, right? And that kind of stops us from taking a step forward, because those are big things, to change any of those things that are a big deal. So to take away from the readers, what I would say is, first of all, trust in yourself, the deepest part of yourself, and trust that you actually are capable of having a positive impact on your local and wider community. And then allow yourself to experiment and move forward. Like, have some faith that there's some spark of, something inside us that should be released. And let it out on a daily basis in some small way, and then that will you'll build evidence-based trust after a while.
Absolutely. Colin, I want to thank you for joining us on the show today, for all the stories, the insights, the experience, the wisdom that you've had to share with all of our listeners today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much to you, Luke. Can I just say, by the way, that anybody that wants to hear more from me, my website, it's colinbeavan.com. Anybody come by and visit, you can contact me and ask questions. I'm always there. And thanks so much. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks, Colin. And actually, for everybody, the Colin's website is going to be posted in our show notes, so you can see colinbeavan.com. You can certainly look up No Impact Man, and you're going to track him down very easily right now. And his latest book of How to Be Alive, which really is just a fascinating expansion of what conversation we've begun here today. So the last couple of things I wanted to leave you with, because I just think this summarizes so much of what we're talking about today, was first, to be okay to be with the uncertainty. It's all right to be in the fog. It's okay to not know exactly where you are at any given moment. But from there, you can begin to experiment. Once you begin to experiment, you can begin to let the unfolding occur. See what begins to emerge. Look around for what some of those signs are, and you may just find that mentor, that friend, that colleague, that coach who's just that little bit ahead of you that can continue to inspire you on your journey, on your quest. So as always, I want to thank you so much for joining us here today on the show. And until next time, continue to enjoy the journey. Thanks for tuning in to The Meaningful Way. If you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor and please subscribe and follow along with all these great guests, their stories and interviews. Also, it helps us a lot if you not only share some of your favorite episodes online, but also provide us feedback. Go into iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever your favorite podcast app happens to be, and rate the show. Provide us some feedback and let us know how it is that we're doing. If you want to learn more about what we're up to, whether it be with the IPEC Coach Training School, the Live, Lead, Play Network, or even just what's evolving with The Meaningful Way, go on and head on over to lukeiorio.com.